Welcome, welcome, one and all. It is I, your boy, Dr. Mavima, here again, back with another video. I know it's been a long hiatus. Uh, what can I say? Life happens. I'm sorry. I come here when I can. I've had this idea for a while, though. And this idea is rooted in a very, you have one of those experiences where you realize a gap in your knowledge that you think, I should definitely know this right away, right? And the gap in my knowledge was this. When you see the footage of Zimbabwe getting its independence in 1980, okay, the Union Jack, the British flag is lowered, folded, and handed to Prince Charles, now King Charles. Um, and then it's replaced by the seven striped Zimbabwean flag as we know it today. Which I always, you understand that, right? Because Zimbabwe was a British colony prior to that. However, I was thinking recently that if the era of British rule had ended in 1965 when Ian Smith and them declared the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, making Zimbabwe Rhodesia an independent settler colony, right up until the end of colonialism. If they had divorced themselves from the British Empire, why was it the British flag that was coming down? So those of you already know where this is going. So then I spoke to, I called the big homies, including my dad, and said, "Hey, let me know what happened here." And they schooled me real quick. And the short version, of course, is that immediately after, when the UDI had failed or was ending, there was a brief Zimbabwe Rhodesia period. Then that also failed. Then there was a Lancaster House conversations in 1979, and for that brief period between the end of 1979 and April 1980, when Zimbabwe gets its independence, it reverted back to being a British colony briefly, right, under British administration. That's the long and short of it. And if you really want, you can bounce right now. But the long form video takes us through all that and describes how this teapot shaped landmass we call Zimbabwe today had four distinct flags in a matter of 8 months between August of 1979 and April of 1980, right? The Rhodesian flag, the Rhodesia Zimbabwe flag, the Union Jack, and then the seven striped flag as we know it today. So this is that story right there. And before I get any further, I really want to emphasize some of the sources I used for this, right? The most important source, arguably the most important source I refer to is this book. Is my favorite book on Zimbabwean history, very accessible. It's called Becoming Zimbabwe. It's edited by Brian Raftopoulos and Alois Mlambo, who I've had the pleasure of meeting. Very good man. It's an edition though, so it's got each period of history dating back to pre-colonial era right up until 2008, written by different scholar. A lot of them who I've met and are very respectable. So I use this a lot. I also use this here. This is Sovereignty, Corruption, and Civil Service Reform Implementation in Zimbabwe by Dr. Paul Mavima, same last name. That's my old man. You put this out. Now, this is obviously not a history book in the same vein as this one is, but I really like the part when it talks about the early days of administration. So the parts where I talk about the British South African Company and responsible government in Zimbabwe in the early 20th century, I use this a lot. Then in addition to that, there's one website, I'll link it below, that I really liked, that focuses on flags, and it's called The Flags of Our Ancestors, I believe. That's the name of the website. I think it's loser.com, loeser.com. I'll be sure to link that here because it's a very quick, accessible progression of the different flags of Zimbabwe, other countries as well, but of course I was focusing on the Zimbabwean flag. So without further ado, let's get into our conversation here with how Zimbabwe ends up, or how this landmass that we call Zimbabwe today ends up having four distinct flags in a space of 8 or 9 months. I hope you enjoy this. I'll see you at the end. So, where shall we start? Well, if we're going to talk about flags and center this narrative around flags, then we have to introduce colonialism, right? Because functionally, flag in many communities outside of Europe and these places, and of course, different places have their own banners. But if we're talking about flags as we understand them as symbols of the modern nation, then those are the idea of that as representing the modern nation are a vintage of colonialism, right? So let's start there, of European colonialism in particular. European intrusion into the teapot-shaped nation that today we call Zimbabwe dates back to the 16th century, right, the 1500s, with mainly the Portuguese as the first Europeans to arrive in this place. This is immediately in the aftermath of Great Zimbabwe and the heyday of the Mutapa Empire, right? And they'll come in trading, fighting, trying to claim land, a back and forth of sort. We won't go into too much detail on that because that's a topic for another day. I want to make sure that we get to what you guys came here to hear as quickly as possible, right? But they set up shop, particularly on the eastern side of Zimbabwe, after fighting with the different indigenous groups in modern day Zimbabwe had sort of limited them to land holdings on the eastern side, closer to Mozambique. By the 19th century, in the early stages of the scramble for Africa, European explorers galore were entering the space as well, right? Not just the Portuguese guys, but British and other folks. In the 1860s, for example, German explorer Karl Marx and British settler Henry Hartley, quote-unquote, discovered gold near Mupfure River in Mashonaland, which led to waves upon waves of European settlers. And the scramble for Africa was well underway. It's in the 1880s that the scramble officially revs up. The Berlin Conference, right? The Berlin Conference, which sort of formalizes the scramble for Africa, happens in 1884, 1885, bringing together the 14 different nations, right? From the British, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese. The US is also there. Russia is also there. The Ottoman, Sweden, and so forth. 14 altogether. Again, that's a topic for another day. I think I've done a video on that already. I'll link it below here about that particular conference in which the continent was essentially divided, with no Africans there, by the way, so they don't even know what are going at this point. So in the aftermath of that, prospectors, traders, hunters, and so forth land on the continent largely, right? Now they're coming in large numbers. Now, in 1886, gold is discovered in Witwatersrand in Gauteng, right? Close to Pretoria there in South Africa, which is at the time was the Boer heartland. Remember, the Boers have been pushed from the Cape by the British and landed up there, right, with the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, right? So indeed, the following year, Paul Kruger, right, the Prime Minister of the Boer republics, sends Grobler to Lobengula, and the Grobler Treaty is signed, 1887. Unnerved by how his opponents were moving, right, Cecil John Rhodes of the British South African Company, it was British, right, opponents being the Dutch settlers, opponents of the British in colonizing that part of the continent. Unnerved by this, right, Cecil John Rhodes sends his own emissaries, John Moffat, to sign an exclusive treaty with Lobengula, which was followed 3 months later by the Rod Concession, initially driven by the idea of creating another rand across the Limpopo. What do we mean by another rand? The discovery of gold in South Africa by Witwatersrand, that whole thing, the creation of the industry and the birth of Johannesburg in the aftermath of the discovery of gold at the Witwatersrand. They were hoping to do the same thing across the Limpopo, which is in modern day Zimbabwe, right? So that's what's inspiring them. While Lobengula was still protesting this raw deal, the British government granted Rhodes permission to create the British South African Company in October of 1889. Make no mistake about it, the BSAC was a colonial force. If you've listened to my other videos before, if you just know this, colonialism can largely be classified in four ways, right? There was direct colonialism, right? Indirect colonialism, which is more synonymous with the British, direct more synonymous with the French and the Belgians and the likes. Direct, indirect, settler colonialism, which eventually is what happens in Rhodesia, South Africa, Algeria, and places like that, where the colonizers actually come by the hundreds of thousands or maybe millions to settle in these places, right? So even places like the US, Australia, those are quintessential settler colonies at heart. But there was also a company rule, which is when, with the support of the metropolitan government, British, French, whatever the colonial force was, a company was given the reins to a community. They could go there and exploit the resources as much as they wanted to, and if they had any problems, they could call on the support of the metropole, as it were. So the British South African Company is one such force, right? They had the mandate to build roads, railways, establish banks, settle territories, mine, and of particular relevance here, fly the flag. So the British South African Company, they get to work mining, claiming land, and despite the Anglo-Ndebele Wars of 1893, then 1896 and 1897, right, what we call the first Chimurenga or Chimvukela, right, the country was, for all intents and purposes, by the country now we're talking about Zimbabwe, was for all intents and purposes a colony by the middle of that decade, of that last decade of the 19th century. It was under police rule by 1895. While Rhodes himself had preferred the name Zambezia, the other settlers moved along the idea Rhodesia, right? And in 1892, Rhodesia, named for Cecil John Rhodes, the Rhodesian Herald, which was the first newspaper in town, began circulating. In 1895, the BSAC officially adopted the name Rhodesia, and as such, to keep it moving, the BSAC flag flew over what we call Zimbabwe now for the first time in 1892 in Salisbury, which is now Harare, the capital, and 1893 in Bulawayo. This flag would fly over the country until 1923. So that's the first in our series of flags that we're talking about today. Enter the 20th century. South of Limpopo, events that would influence the very nature of governance in the north were taking place. After a series of wars between the British and the Dutch descendant settlers, right, in what is now South Africa, and these wars were known for a long time as the Anglo-Boer Wars, now commonly known as the South African Wars. The two settled for peace and formed the Union of South Africa in 1910. Now it is important here, well, not that important for this video, but just know that the Union of South Africa was the union of the British and the Dutch, and excluded by and large the black and brown people who lived in that region for thousands of years, sort of part of the long process that got us to apartheid, right? But nevertheless, after the Union of South Africa was formed, the white settlers were not done, however. Under the leadership of Jan Smuts, they wanted to bring the territory of Southern Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe, into their union as well, and spend much of the next decade proposing it to be so. Now, many of the British colonial settlers were against joining the Union of South Africa and were pushing for the establishment of responsible government instead, as had been implemented in places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa itself. In a nutshell, the idea of responsible government is meant to grant the settlers an elevated degree of autonomy while still remaining a part of the empire. They are not independent, yet they are also not directly answerable to the monarch, the king or the queen. Instead, they do their own thing and are answerable to parliament instead. So this was the option that the settlers were pushing for. In the 1920 election, there had been three schools of opinion in Southern Rhodesia. One favoring responsible government inside Southern Rhodesia, one favoring a continuation of rule through the British South African Company, and the third believing that the best solution would be to join the Union of South Africa. A little bit after that, the British South African company decided to pull out, and that was no longer an option. So the two remaining choices were responsible government or to join South Africa. A referendum on the status of Southern Rhodesia was held in the colony on 27 October 1922. Voters, almost all of them white, were given the options of establishing responsible government or joining the Union of South Africa. After 59% of the voters voted in favor of responsible government, it was officially granted on the 1st of October 1923. Following the granting of responsible government, Southern Rhodesia became a British colony, and the British Union flag became the official flag, the Union Jack, right? It would be the official flag until 1968, but we'll get to that soon. While the Union Jack was indeed the official flag from 1923, the Rhodesian settlers were, as you can understand, underwhelmed by this notion of using the imperial flag wherever they went. After all, other places with responsible government, like South Africa and New Zealand, had their own flags, albeit ensigns bearing the Union Jack. Ensigns, right? Another term for flag, but what that just means is the flag, which includes the Union Jack, as you see with the Australian and New Zealand flags right now. They are different, but they include the British flag in there, right? Thus, beginning in 1937, a dual flag policy later came into effect when distinctive Rhodesian ensigns were also used and flew side by side with the Union flag. And that's the flags that you can see alongside here, right? So the one flag, the blue ensign, was used outside the colony only, while the Union flag, the Union Jack, remained the official flag and thus continued to fly within the colony. This ensign, the other one, not the Union Jack, the blue ensign, was in use up until 1953 when the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland was formed. Wait, what? The Federation? Alright, let's talk about it. The Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, also called the Central African Federation, was a political unit created in 1953 and ended on December 31, 1963, that embraced the settler-dominated colony of Southern Rhodesia, right, Zimbabwe, which is what we're talking about, and the territories of Northern Rhodesia, Zambia, and Nyasaland, modern-day Malawi, which were under the control of the British Colonial Office. At its core, the Federation was driven by the growing population in Southern Rhodesia's intention to secure their place as a settler colony within Southern Africa. The growing British or white population, right? They wanted to secure themselves as a settler colony within Southern Africa. The settler population reckoned that between their livelihoods in Southern Rhodesia, the raw materials of the copper belt in Northern Rhodesia, Zambia, and the labor pool in Nyasaland, an amalgamation of these three territories would be economically advantageous, right? Furthermore, the Federation was meant to preempt the rise of anti-colonial African nationalism in those territories, right? Which had become, there was a wave of African nationalism on the rise since the end of the Second World War. I've also done a video on that. I will link it below. So it was meant to preempt the rise of, to preempt the rise of African nationalism, right? Anti-colonial nationalism by establishing marginal African representation in local government, sort of to placate the natives, as it were, and two, to put more stringent rules to regulate the growth of African nationalism in the country. To form, in the years of federation, the economy of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland boomed. It really rose. However, not only did the Africans not receive the representation in government that they had hoped for, the African nationalists, the economy improving did not improve for them. So what does that mean, right? When the economy gets better for the richer, right? The richer get richer and the poor get poorer. That just widens the gap and only further to exacerbate the tensions, the racial tensions within the colonies. And as such, right, the federation would not last too long. By 1963, it would be done. However, the flag on your screen right now is the flag of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, also known as the Central African Federation. The Federation was dissolved on 31 December 1963, following which each territory assumed a separate political identity, with Northern Rhodesia becoming independent Republic of Zambia and Nyasaland becoming Malawi under African leadership in 1964. In Southern Rhodesia, however, white settlers remained firmly in control, determined to resist all moves towards majority black rule. A new flag for Southern Rhodesia was raised for the first time on 22 April 1964. This was a light blue ensign with a shield from the coat of arms. You can see it on your screen right now. The main motivation for adopting the light blue background as opposed to the traditional dark blue, synonymous with the British rule, was that it was felt that a clear break had to be made from the situation before and during the federal period, which most white Rhodesians felt very emotional about, particularly their perceived poor treatment by the British government during the dissolution of the Federation. And in a nutshell, right, as the Federation collapsed, this was in many ways marking the end of the British colonial era. The sun was setting on the British Empire as we had known it. The British were suffering from what we call imperial fatigue. They had been through 2 world wars, a Great Depression, right? The hypocrisy of the Atlantic Charter, while still holding on to your colonies, was becoming palpable. So, when they were going to grant independence to South Rhodesia, they said they would only grant it if South Rhodesia was going to go to majority rule, which would have meant majority black rule. And the settlers, the Rhodesian settlers, were not down with that. Remember, there's hundreds and thousands of them in this territory at this point. They were not willing to do that. So what do? They declare what we call today a Unilateral Declaration of Independence. Right. Not to be confused with a UTI, which is the urinary tract infection. Though both are equally terrible. But in any case, what is this? I'll talk about the UDI shortly. But all we can say is this flag with the light blue ensign was flown from 22 April 1964 up until 1968, right? So which means it lasted a little bit longer than 3 years into the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, right? The Unilateral Declaration of Independence happens in 1965, 11 November 1965. What is this? Let's rehash what that is. The British want the empire to be done and will grant independence to South Rhodesia only if they will move towards black majority rule. The white South Rhodesians do not want that, and they decide to go it alone by declaring what is known as the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, right? And remember, now it's just called Rhodesia. They're no longer Southern Rhodesia. They dropped the Southern because Northern Rhodesia was now Zambia, so there was no need to qualify themselves. So they've dropped that. So in 1965, 11 November, they declared this Unilateral Declaration of Independence, right? Which meant that they were ceding themselves from the British Empire. They were doing their own thing. They were no longer part of the British Empire, okay? The independence of Rhodesia was not recognized, and mandatory economic sanctions were imposed on the rebel colony by the United Nations. Fun fact, in so doing, in declaring a UDI, Rhodesia became only the second country to unilaterally declare its independence from the British Empire. The first one, USA. Yeah, right? So to signify the severing of colonial links, a new flag was adopted on 11 November 1968, 4 years to the day after the last one, and which was 3 vertical stripes of green, white, and green, with a national coat of arms in the center of the white stripe. This is a bootleg Nigerian flag, if you will, with just the coat of arms right in the middle. And this flag was used in Rhodesia until September 1st of 1979, when it was replaced by the flag of Zimbabwe Rhodesia. Zimbabwe Rhodesia, a country with a last name? Well, we'll get to that next. Now, in addition to the United Nations and the rest of the world condemning the rebel colony and UDI, right, much like apartheid South Africa was being condemned at the same time, the African nationalists were definitely not feeling it as well, of course, right? So what do we get as a result, in addition to the economic sanctions being imposed externally? Intense fighting, right? Increased guerrilla struggle, or known as the Rhodesian Bush War, or what we call the Second Chimurenga, or Umvukela, Chimurenga being the Shona term and Umvukela being the Ndebele term, with led by the African militants of Zanla and Zipra, with the support of independent Zambia as well as troops in Mozambique eventually. And that war was vicious. About 40,000 people are estimated to have died in this fighting between the beginning of the UDI until 1979, right? When the negotiations for independence were put into place. Now, 40,000, that's a large number. By anti-colonial fights, I think it's only topped, if I remember correctly, by the Algerian War, which is, 1 million people and then some. But the Mau had around 30,000, so comparable to this. But really the fighting was largely in the settler colonies, because that's where the people are that you can fight. So in 1978, right, from all this fighting and the economic sanctions taking their toll, also with encouragement from South Africa to see if the Rhodesian government could negotiate to have like black leadership, but moderate black leadership, or black puppet leadership, right? So in any case, in 1978, the Rhodesian government reached a compromise with the internally based African leaders, resulting in universal suffrage elections in February 1979. Now, this was not all it was crafted to be. It was actually a sneaky way. This wasn't a move towards black majority rule, in good faith. It was meant to preserve white control of many of the important industries, right? And I quote again from Becoming Zimbabwe. As international pressure mounted, Smith, right, the Rhodesian Prime Minister, made attempts to form a government that was acceptable to the international community. This culminated in the 1978 internal settlement, which saw the creation of a coalition government comprising Smith, right, Muzorewa, Sithole, and Chief Chirao. These are the leaders who were not the leaders of the main African nationalist parties, but these were some of the internal leaders who appeared to be amenable who were friendly to the Rhodesians at this point. Indeed, Muzorewa and Sithole had at least one thing in common with Smith: their resentment towards the patriotic front of ZANU and ZAPU. The two ostracized leaders fulfilled Smith's criteria for preferred African candidates to assume leadership. Neither had an army to talk about, thus they were not a security threat, and they were also desperate to pull the political rug from under the feet of the political front, which was leading, the main militants, if you will, the main nationalist movements, right? Chirao, an African chief with loyalty to Smith, was roped in to give the new white survival package a semblance of support by the traditional authorities. This new state was named Zimbabwe Rhodesia to give the impression that the arrangement ushered in a new era of racial partnership. And thus you see the flag that you see here, right?
Now, I hear you saying, well, if it moved to black rule anyway, or black majority rule and universal suffrage under the leadership of Muzorewa and those guys, what's the problem? Well, the Smith was not dumb, right? He had neither capitulated nor abandoned his belief in white superiority, and the details of the political arrangement here during the period clearly communicated this fact. The property rights of whites were to remain sacred, while the control of the judiciary, the public service, the army, and the police was to remain in white hands. Whites were also to be accorded the right to dual citizenship, right? Something that the black people, of course, were not accorded. The constitutional provisions ensured continued white privilege in parliament by allowing 20 seats for whites to be elected on a separate roll, plus another 8 on a common roll, while the 72 remaining seats were filled by blacks, initially from the 3 African leaders' party list, right? So to guarantee, more than a fourth of the more than a fourth of government would always be white, right? Even though that population made up, single digit numbers of the population. In any case, to authenticate these arrangements, an election was held which pitted the 3 African signatories, Muzorewa, Sithole, Chirau, against each other, and Muzorewa won outright. He won 64 of the 72 seats. Right. However, it's important here to say the main nationalist parties led by Mugabe and Nkomo were, the Patriotic Front. They were boycotting these elections and telling people not to vote. So the fact that almost 2 million people voted, even though people were boycotting it, wasn't really an endorsement of these candidates. People were not feeling these candidates, but you know what? They were sick of the war, so they wanted it to be done. I'm setting this up to say this Zimbabwe Rhodesia arrangement with Muzorewa as the leader was never going to hold, and was barely recognized by the international community. In the meantime, however, a Rhodesia Zimbabwe flag flew, right? And it's as you see it below. A new flag, which had a vertical black stripe with white, and at the hoist, and 3 horizontal stripes of red, white, and green in the fly. A yellow Zimbabwe bird was also on the black stripe of the canton. Black symbolized the achievement of majority rule in the country. Red stood for the struggle for independence, and yellow represented the mineral wealth, and green the agricultural and natural resources of the country. The vertical white stripe represented the white community, while the central horizontal white stripe stood for peace. So this is at the top of this video I said 4 flags in 18 months. The first of those flags, which immediately precedes this in 1979, is the Rhodesian flag, that the green and white one. Then this is the second one, right? Officially, this flag was short-lived, as it was replaced on 12 December 1979. So it only flew for a couple of months by the British Union flag. Guess who's back, right? Because what had happened here, the country had not been recognized by the international community because the ZANU and ZAPU, right, the main nationalist organizations which had been pushed into exile, were not accommodated, were not even considered for this. And the international community recognized that those were the main African nationalist parties, not Muzorewa or Sithole at this point. So the new state was not recognized, and UN sanctions were maintained, and also the war continued. If anything, the war in 1978 and 1979 only ratcheted up, right? The period after 1978 was arguably the most atrocious of the liberation war, right? With the government pressing for a ceasefire and the guerrillas continuing with what they believed was a legitimate fight against a sellout arrangement by Muzorewa, Sithole, and Chirau, right? So, and at the time, I know I've said already that Muzorewa and Sithole did not have armies, But with the encouragement of Ian Smith, they developed their own militias. So that adds another fighting force. So we have the Rhodesian forces, Zanla and Zipra, right, who are the main nationalist organizations. But also now Sithole and Muzorewa have their own militias. So it's just a whole quagmire of fighting there. In fact, more people died in this last couple of years than in the past 12 years of the Chimurenga. Umvukela. So the new government was dogged by the continuing war and the crumbling economy, and Muzorewa failed to deliver most of the promises he had made in his election campaign, right? Also, this is hampered by a drought in that period, 78-79, which saw a failure of crops. So as the war raged on, and this is a seminal moment here in September of 1978, when Zipra guerrillas shot down an Air Rhodesia flight bound for Kariba in September of 1978, where 18 of the 54 people aboard the plane survived the crash, but 14 of them were then shot by the guerrillas. So, and another plane was shot down in 1979, killing 54 passengers and 5 crew members. Then other acts of sabotage, like the blowing up of oil storage tanks in Harare and so forth. So the war was just going crazier and crazier. So all this eventually forced the leaders, right, both the nationalist leaders, the black leaders, Muzorewa and them, and Rhodesia, to go back to the drawing board. And the people were also who had come out to vote for Muzorewa, not because they loved him, but because they were hoping for a cessation of hostilities, were also disappointed. We're talking about the masses here. And they're like, okay, so this didn't work out. So even they're pushing now for further discourse on this, right? And all this culminated in the 1979 Lancaster House Conference, right? The Lancaster House Conference, you know, as many people attended it, right? It was there were representatives from the Patriotic Front, Nkomo and Mugabe, right, leading the nationalist movements. The Muzorewa delegation, which included Sithole and Smith. And the conference was, to a large extent, the result of several forces grown weary of fighting. Zambia and Mozambique, for instance, were desperate to end a war which had led to serious loss of lives and economic dislocation in their own countries. The nationalist leaders were also tired of the war. Guerrilla logistics had become even more strained, and inside Rhodesia, both the economy and socio-political life were under severe stress. So what came out of this meeting in Lancaster in England, right? In many ways, it concluded the Rhodesian Bush War, the Chimurenga. It also marked the nullification of the UDI, as British colonial authority was to be restored for a transitional period during which free elections under supervision by the British government would take place. It is at this point that we introduce the third flag in this series of flags, right? On 12th December 1979, yes, the British Union flag is reinstalled as the flag in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. At which point it once again becomes briefly a British colony and reverted to its former name of Southern Rhodesia, right? Then the British Union flag again was reinstated, and while the de jure, the British Union flag was the official flag of the country, de facto, right, the Zimbabwean Rhodesian flag also continued to fly until the new flag of Zimbabwe was adopted at independence in 1980. April 18, 1980. So how do we get there? So in December, the British flag comes back up, 80, and right within 4 months. With the new constitution ready and the ceasefire arranged, the first elections were held to choose the leader of independent Zimbabwe. The fractious alliance that had stood since the Patriotic Front was formed disintegrated. So you know how ZAPU and ZANU had been working together as ZANU-PF in the lead up to the election, with Nkomo and Mugabe coming together. They split and ran separately, as PF ZAPU led by Nkomo and ZANU-PF led by Robert Mugabe. In the elections, Mugabe ZANU-PF won the majority with 57 seats. Nkomo got 20 seats, and Muzorewa was also in the mix, was a distant third with 3 seats. So ultimately, these events culminated in the independence celebrations on April 1980, with Robert Mugabe being installed as the first prime minister of independent Zimbabwe, at which point we get the seven-striped flag that we know today as the banner of the country of Zimbabwe. So what does it mean? The black stripe which is in the center represents the black majority. The red line on either side of it represents the blood spilled during the Chimurenga Umvukela. Yellow, right, represents the country's mineral wealth, and green represents the vegetation and agriculture. The white triangle stands for peace. Some people erroneously believe that it stands for the white minority, but that was in the Zimbabwe Rhodesia flag. On the Zimbabwean flag itself, it stands for peace. And the yellow Zimbabwe bird is the national emblem going back, decades. It was even on the Rhodesian flag and other flags, right? So that is the flag that we now get. So what does that make it? That concludes, and now Zimbabwe is independent and so forth. That story is another story going forward. But as I promised you, we have those 4 flags in 8 months, right? Because as of September 1979, the flag that flew at the beginning of the month, or at the end of August anyway, was the Rhodesian flag with the green stripes, with the green horizontal stripes and white in the middle, and the coat of arms, which was then replaced by the Zimbabwe Rhodesia flag, right, under the leadership of Muzorewa, which would fly for 2 months, but only while hostilities only ratcheted up in that period. And then in December, right, in December of that month, the British flag comes back as the countries are forced back to the drawing board, and that flag would fly for 3 or 4 months, until April 18, right, 4 months, when it was replaced by the Zimbabwean flag. And that is the moment that, remember at the beginning of this video, I said I wondered why it was the British flag that was being famously taken down and handed to Prince Charles, now King Charles. Man, and also that's a lesson in patience, right? Because it was Prince Charles back then taking down flags, and some 40 plus years later he finally becomes king. Look at you go, Charlie. Indeed, and that is why it wasn't the Rhodesian flag that was being taken down. It was the British flag, because for a moment, brief moment just before independence, the country had reverted back to being a British colony under British administration in anticipation of independence. And with that, this video has gone on way too long. I will put all my sources and other interesting videos that I've mentioned in the description box, and I hope you enjoy this one. Thank you all very much. And that is how Zimbabwe had 4 flags in about 8 months. Thank you very much. I've been singing Mavima 1.